medieval ages began in the 5th century and stretched to the 15th century. Commonly referred to as the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, they were plagued by war and illness and disease. With very few antibiotics and strange cures, many people died in this era.
Christianity unified Eastern and Western Europe. Christianity was divided in 1054. The Western branch divided into the Roman Catholic Church, and the Eastern branch divided into the Orthodox Church. Martin Luther introduced the idea of Protestantism, which further split the Christian Church. The Protestant Reformation occurred as an effect.
The split of the Roman Empire in the beginning of the 5th century marked the two halves of Europe into Western Ravenna and Eastern Constantinople. The Battle of Hastings on October 14th, 1066, had Normans claiming all English lands who introduced feudalism. The feudalism system began on a manor, with lords as the highest of the manor and serfs underneath them working their land for agriculture and livestock. Above the lords were knights and kings, and God was at the highest pillar of it. The Black Death started in 1328 and lasted until 1351, with outbreaks for the next 60 years. Over a third of the people died in Europe, and the population drop resulted in a higher value being placed on labor, which eventually led to a peasants' revolt in 1381. The Crusades began when Christians waged a war against Muslims to try and release Jerusalem from their control. Christians wanted to reserve Jerusalem as the birthplace of Jesus. The Crusades lasted almost 200 years with constant warfare and uncountable deaths. The medieval times had many different markets as they moved through the centuries. The 12th century was dominated by mining. Mining of metals helped the people create tools and inventions that would later be needed to further their society. The 13th century was dominated by agriculture, as the population was growing and everyone needed to eat. However, farmers were still under the command of the lords which manor they lived on. In the 14th century, labor was scarce in every field because of the plague that swept through Europe. There were few workers, thus creating a food shortage because no one could tend the crops. Eventually, the population made a recovery, and Europe began to again flourish. Trade and textiles became highly popular, creating a new merchant class that was not previously included in the feudal system. As these merchants crossed to new lands to trade their goods, shipbuilding became a widely popular profession and stimulated the growth of the economy yet again. The Magna Carta was an important document signed by King John of England, in which greatly diminished the powers of kings. There were limitations placed that began English, and eventually American, liberties. Those restraints placed were: church was outside of the English government, no taxes were levied without consent, they had trial by jury, aka due process, and all weights and measures were to be constant in the kingdom. Kings of the time were considered the second highest power, God being the first. They were highly respected and their rule was rarely challenged. Until the Magna Carta, peasants had no power. This bill allowed greater freedoms to the working class, although they were still not actively involved in government.
Medieval music was very sacred and secular. There was no notation for rhythm. It was extremely dramatic, and oftentimes wooden and string instruments were used.
Art was very religiously driven. As church dominated many people's lives, they were inspired by it. God was depicted in most art with his apostles and other Bible figures surrounding him. The colors were mostly muted, with bright colors around areas that the artist wanted to emphasize. Personal portraits were very rare to non-existent. They did not find honor in depicting themselves. Art adorned churches to make them seem rich and highly attached to God. Heads of the church wanted people to believe that they had a direct connection with God, and the art made it seem like God was there with them all the time, instilling a respectful fear for religion. This helped to control the minds of the peasants and place church higher above them than lords. Once the Black Death had a grip on Europe and the church could not fix it, many people lost faith in the church. They began to question if God was real and if the church should really have as much power as they possessed at the time. This opened up many new art forms for people, like bronzework, mosaics, stained glass, and ceramics. Religious figures were still used in art by some that had a deep faith, but the frequency was drastically reduced. Stained glass became more common than before, with installation in many homes. More inspiration was found in nature than ever before, and paintings of beautiful countryside homes and fields can be seen. Kings, queens, and lords were also painted to show their high status and riches.
Dance was very popular in the medieval times. At first, it was rejected by the church, and originally only males took part in dancing. As it became more popular, it became more accepted by the church. It helped to establish a cultural identity and also improved socialization within the communities.
The Crusades brought European scholars Islamic medicine, science, and astronomy. Alchemy was very popular during these times. Referred to as medieval chemists, alchemists were focused on finding immortality and the philosopher's stone, which was said to turn metals such as iron into gold. Astrology played a large role in medieval times due to many people believing the movement of the stars and planets had a direct effect on human life. Philosophy influenced medieval literature by questioning every aspect of the universe, including the existence of God. Medicine improved during this time thanks to Middle Eastern advances in medication and treatment. Inventions of the Dark Ages had much to do with war, astronomy, and science. A catapult called the trebuchet was created to hurl rocks, balls of flaming straw, and other dangerous objects at their enemies. Crossbows were also developed at this time as a new form of handheld weaponry. The astrolabe was created by astronomers to study the position and latitude of planets, including our own. The sun was often tracked using it to develop an idea of the Earth's tilt and how it created seasons. The alembic still was an alchemy tool that distilled chemicals. This tool was used to try and create an immortal juice. People in the medieval times were very interested with living forever, as they feared that when they died they could possibly go to hell. This again shows how religion commandeered the Dark Ages.
The biggest change to social life in the medieval times was the reform of the church, when Christianity was divided into Roman Catholic and Orthodox. The population adapted from being in rural communities to creating more of towns and cities as technology further advanced.
Canterbury Tales, an excerpt from The Knight's Tale. Once upon a time, old stories tell us, there was a duke whose name was Theseus. Of Athens he was lord and governor, and in his time was such a conqueror that none was greater underneath the sun, so many wealthy countries he had won. What with his wisdom and his chivalry, he conquered all the realm of Femine, which then was known as Scythica, and married the queen named Hippolyta, whom he carried back home with him amid much pageantry and glorious ceremony. Dante degli Alighieri was an Italian poet of the Middle Ages. His famous epic poem, Divine Comedy, is a look into what Dante believed to be the afterlife. His character travels through hell, purgatory, and heaven, representing the soul's journey to God. When this was made public, the people of the Middle Ages still had a deep fear of God and their fate after death. It is often regarded as the epitome of Middle Age ideals. References to Divine Comedy can be seen in many works of literature through the ages, and also depictions of the events in the book have been immortalized in art. The Banquet was a series of poems that Dante published about learning, including philosophy, science, politics, and linguistics. Dante's poetry was packed with introspective concepts that shaped the way poetry was written. Alluding to things instead of directly stating them made readers think about the meaning of poetry and form their own ideas about its meaning. Modern poetry often follows this pattern.